The conservative counter-revolution in the era of Reagan and George H.W. Bush. After Johnson's success over Goldwater in 1965 and 1966, conservatism seemed to have run its course in national politics. Conservatism grew from 1966 to 1980 for many reasons. The increase in the standard of living between the 1950s and the 1960s, the appearance of inflation in the 1970s, which distorted the view of the economic utopia. Blue-collar workers became more focused on their own economic problems. White backlash to affirmative action and social programs that seemed to disproportionately benefit women and people of color. Popularity of the term big spending liberals. Trade unions and their support for Democrats, which weakened. The presidencies of Johnson and Carter and the assassinations of the Kennedys. Large amount of social reforms throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Social spending which was incompatible with economic growth. The moving of nearly 40 million Americans from the Northeast and Midwest to the Sun Belt. The shift of population to conservative suburbs. The maturing of the war baby generation who had not lived through the Great Depression and often had little or no contact with people of color. And the association of Democrats with welfare programs, urban riots, high taxes, busing, and affirmative action. Conservatism was legitimized by a few different points. Conservative theorists of the 1950s were distrustful of the general public, who was believed to be easily manipulated by liberals and the mass media. Conservatism grew considerably in the 1970s due to grassroots followings within fundamentalist religious groups. The new religious political right, NRPR, was formed and contained many independent congregations, individuals, and groups like the Moral Majority. In the late 1970s, the conservative movement was ripe for the emergence and found Ronald Reagan as a great figurehead. Reagan was relatable because of his family sufferings throughout poverty, turmoil, and alcoholism. Though Democrat until 1962, he had gradually moved to the right as he became a national public speaker for conservative audiences. Reagan idealized the idea of the self-made man. He valued the virtues of hard work, persistence, and risk-taking. He believed that assistance should only be given in times of extreme need, and assistance of family and friends should be sufficient. He also believed that racism and discrimination were too much of a focus in America. He also believed that civil rights was a state issue, that women were accorded primarily domestic functions, that social welfare programs were unfavorable, and that economic inequality is an incentive for the poor to improve their economic conditions. He focused on three main themes, which were lowering taxes, increasing American defense, and cutting social spending. Reagan supported the idea of supply-side economics, which replaced Keynesian economics, or the use of government spending and changes in interest rates to offset recessions and inflations, because it seemed inadequate to solve stagflation. It also offered a solution to stagflation, while also addressing problems of inflation and unemployment. It justified a major reduction in taxes, and it also suggested that economic growth would not follow tax cuts, but cuts in government spending were not required. Reagan won the 1980 election in a landslide victory, carrying the majority of the male vote, the entire southern and western regions of the country, as well as many blue-collar Democrats. Reagan's first move when he entered office. During the first 8 months in office, Reagan secured major budget cuts, tax cuts, elimination of many regulations, reductions in government policy rules, and massive increases in military spending. He had three major conservative victories. The first was the budget cuts through the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or OBRA. He also achieved tax cuts and increases in defense spending. OBRA's plan consisted of heavy, multi-million-dollar budget cuts, the termination of some social programs, specifically work programs such as CETA, the reduction of eligibility for food stamps, AFDC programs, and unemployment insurance, and the Economic Recovery Tax Act that inequitably lowered income taxes for most Americans over a 3-year period. In September of 1981, Reagan began losing momentum. Reagan's possibility for the future looked slimming. His administration split into two different groups, one that feared an uncontrollable federal deficit without tax increases, the other which opposed tax increases for the sake of economic growth. The 1981 recession also raised unemployment and doubts about economic policy. Congress also began to believe that they had been manipulated during budget and tax deliberations. Reagan's administration attacked Social Security and Medicare, but cuts were defeated unanimously. Reagan appointed a blue ribbon task force that extended the age at which Social Security could be taken, as well as decreased potential benefits. Medicare benefits were reduced through indirect methods of national payment levels, leading to premature discharges of patients. Medicaid was reduced by only contracting hospitals with low bids. CETA was terminated and replaced with the Job Training Partnership Act, or JTPA, but was far less beneficial, especially to women. Reagan won another landslide victory in 1984, which helped him to enter his second term. The American people stood to the left of Reagan in public opinion polls, however liked him as a person, believed him to be a decisive leader, and favored his buildup of the military. They disagreed, however, with his opinion on the welfare state. Reagan's second term was very much a stalemate. In his second term, there was increased defense spending. However, Congress disallowed for further cuts in social programs. George H.W. Bush won the election of 1988, most distinctively after accusing his opponent of being a liberal, which held the same stigma at the time as communism did in the 1950s. Bush had no clear agenda for his term, similar to Reagan's second term. Bush wanted to maintain a large military presence and did not want to cut taxes. However, he was much more lenient to increases in social spending. Congress ultimately placed caps on both defense and social spending during Bush's term. Fiscal policy limited his options to do much of anything about the federal deficit, as whatever he did had negative consequences for his future, especially in the next election. Many groups were oppressed during the Reagan and Bush era. Women were underpaid, limited to the glass ceiling, and were underrepresented in politics. Family planning was also underfunded, and the Roe v. Wade decision seemed vulnerable. Poor people faced cuts in public assistance, as well as increases in unemployment. People of color were the most heavily affected by these economic changes. Immigrants were affected by legislation such as the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. Gay men and lesbians were affected heavily by the growing AIDS epidemic. People with disabilities received little help, but did benefit from the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Children faced the aftermath of their parents' social and economic situations. Aging Americans faced increasing health costs after cuts in Medicare and Medicaid benefits. And the homeless population grew heavily during this period.